The air inside the theater was electric, filled with whispers and the buzzing excitement of thousands waiting to see the next act. From backstage, a young Filipino contestant took a deep breath, trying to steady the pounding in his chest. His hands trembled as he gripped the microphone. He wore a simple black leather jacket, shiny under the stage lights, a quiet homage to his idol, Elvis Presley. The moment he had dreamed of his entire life was finally here, and the weight of it almost made his knees weak. The floor manager gave him a nod, and the curtains began to part. He stepped onto the stage, blinking against the brilliance of the lights that poured down on him like a spotlight of destiny. The vastness of the arena hit him all at once, the towering stage, the sea of faces, and the iconic panel of judges sitting just a few feet away. He spotted Simon Cowell first, sitting with his usual composed expression, arms crossed, eyes sharp and skeptical. Next to him were Sofia Vergara and Heidi Klum, both smiling encouragingly, while Howie Mandel gave a small wave. The contestant swallowed hard. The microphone felt heavier now. He took another deep breath and managed a small smile. "Hello," he began softly, his voice echoing through the speakers. "My name is Marco, and I'm from the Philippines." His accent carried warmth and sincerity. The audience responded with a polite round of applause. Simon nodded curtly, gesturing for him to continue. Marco looked down for a second, remembering all those nights back home when he would sing along to Elvis songs on an old cassette player. His father used to tell him, "Son, you have the soul of a singer." Those words gave him courage now. Lifting his head, he said, "I grew up listening to Elvis. He inspired me, he taught me how to feel the music." His tone was honest, filled with reverence. Simon leaned slightly forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. The crowd waited, not yet sure what to expect from this quiet young man. Marco adjusted the mic stand to his height, his fingers trembling slightly as the first notes of the background track began to play. For a split second, the world seemed to pause, the lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the theater. It was just him, the mic, and the dream he carried from halfway across the world. His lips parted, ready to sing, unaware that the next few moments would change everything. The first chords of the classic Elvis song rolled through the theater like a wave of nostalgia, instantly recognizable to anyone who had ever loved rock and roll. Marco closed his eyes for a heartbeat, gathering his courage. Then he opened his mouth, and the sound that emerged made the entire audience freeze. His voice was deep, velvety, and astonishingly rich, echoing through the hall with that same unmistakable tone that once belonged to the king himself. The reaction was immediate. The crowd gasped, several people leaning forward in disbelief. Simon Cowell's eyes widened, his head tilting slightly as if he couldn't trust his own ears. His skeptical smirk faded, replaced by genuine intrigue. Sofia's mouth fell open in shock, while Heidi pressed a hand to her heart, mouthing, "Wow." Howie looked from Simon to the singer, eyebrows raised, clearly amazed. Marco swayed slightly as he sang, his voice perfectly capturing the warmth and swagger of Elvis Presley. Each note carried a mix of power and soul, every lyric dripping with passion. The audience began to cheer mid-performance, unable to contain themselves. The energy in the room shifted completely. What had started as quiet curiosity had turned into roaring admiration. Camera lights flashed across the crowd as fans stood up, waving their arms, singing along to the chorus. Marco's nervousness melted away, confidence took its place. He smiled between verses, a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He no longer looked like a nervous contestant, he looked like a star reborn. Simon leaned forward, elbows on the desk, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. His lips moved as if forming silent words, "He sounds exactly like him." The judges exchanged astonished glances, and the camera zoomed in on Simon's rare expression of disbelief. As the music swelled, Marco's movements became more natural, hips subtly swinging, shoulders loosening. It wasn't imitation anymore, it was instinct. Every gesture, every inflection, every vibrato in his voice echoed the spirit of Elvis Presley, but with something new, something authentic and heartfelt. By the time he hit the final high note, the crowd was already on its feet, clapping and shouting. The energy in the room reached a fever pitch. Marco finished the song with his head tilted back, eyes closed, and the microphone raised high. When the music stopped, the silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the audience erupted, a deafening, emotional roar that shook the entire theater. As the song continued, the transformation in the theater became undeniable. The judges' table, once filled with cautious faces, was now alive with awe. Marco's voice soared effortlessly through the final verses, filling the massive space with warmth and nostalgia. Every lyric carried a pulse, a kind of magic that went beyond imitation. He wasn't just singing Elvis's song, he was channeling the essence of the man himself. And no one felt that more than Simon Cowell. At first, Simon had leaned back in his chair, his usual posture of skepticism and control. But now, he was leaning forward, elbows resting on the desk, eyes locked on the young Filipino performer. His expression softened, curiosity turned to astonishment, and then to admiration. There was no trace of the critic who often silenced hopefuls with a single harsh comment. Instead, Simon looked like a man witnessing something he couldn't quite explain. Marco's confidence grew with every note. The crowd's energy surged through him like electricity. He began moving more freely, his hips rolling slightly, his shoulders swaying with the rhythm. Each gesture felt natural, not rehearsed, as if Elvis's spirit was guiding him from somewhere beyond. The crowd clapped in rhythm, some singing along, while others simply stood, hands pressed to their hearts. He reached the bridge of the song, the most emotional part, and his voice broke slightly with feeling. That imperfection made it real. It made it human. Simon shook his head slowly, a smile creeping onto his face, the kind of smile he rarely gave, one that said he knew he was witnessing something unforgettable. "How is this possible?" Simon whispered under his breath, loud enough for the microphone to catch. Howie laughed beside him, still amazed, while Sofia and Heidi exchanged glances that said everything. They were moved. Marco hit the final chorus with a power that brought chills. The room was vibrating with applause even before he finished. Simon leaned back again, this time not in doubt, but in quiet surrender to the moment. His expression said it all, disbelief mixed with joy, as if he'd just rediscovered why he loved talent shows in the first place. As the last note echoed, Simon slowly began to clap, deliberate, measured, then stood up, followed by the other judges. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, but all Marco could see was Simon, smiling at him, eyes shining with genuine respect. It was a moment of silent recognition between artist and judge, a moment that would never be forgotten. The final note lingered in the air, trembling with emotion before fading into silence. For a second, the entire theater stood still, a breathless pause that seemed to last forever. Then, like a wave crashing against the shore, the audience erupted. Cheers, whistles, and applause filled every corner of the hall. People rose from their seats, shouting, clapping, and stamping their feet. Some even had tears in their eyes, moved by the haunting familiarity of a voice they thought they'd never hear again. Marco stood at the center of the stage, chest heaving, eyes glistening. He looked stunned, almost unable to believe the reaction unfolding before him. The lights above turned golden, bathing him in a soft, heavenly glow. He blinked up at the ceiling, overwhelmed, as the crowd chanted, "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" Their voices echoed off the walls, a chant not of imitation, but admiration. The judges rose to their feet one by one. Sofia Vergara clapped her hands above her head, smiling brightly. Heidi Klum leaned forward on the desk, her expression filled with awe. Howie Mandel was laughing in disbelief, shaking his head and pointing at Marco as if to say, "Did you just hear that?" And then came the moment that made everything complete. Simon Cowell stood up. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair, eyes never leaving the young Filipino singer. The audience gasped. Simon didn't stand often. When he did, it meant something extraordinary had happened. Marco's lip quivered, and a tear finally slipped down his cheek. He covered his mouth with his hand, struggling to hold himself together. The applause grew louder, echoing through the room like thunder. Confetti hadn't fallen yet, but it felt like it could at any moment. The emotion was so thick in the air that even the cameras seemed to capture more than just a performance. They captured a story, a dream realized. Marco looked out into the crowd and whispered softly, "Thank you, Elvis," his voice breaking as he pressed a hand to his heart. The band members backstage were clapping too, exchanging glances that said they knew they had just witnessed something historic. The judges smiled warmly, still shaking their heads in awe. In that single moment, Marco wasn't just a contestant anymore, he was a bridge between generations, carrying the legacy of Elvis Presley in his heart. And as the cheers continued to rise around him, it was clear that everyone in that room would remember this night for the rest of their lives. The thunderous applause slowly faded as Simon Cowell raised his hand, signaling for quiet. The crowd obeyed, still buzzing with excitement, eager to hear what he would say. Marco stood trembling at center stage, his hands clasped tightly around the microphone, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear anything else. Gold and silver lights glimmered above him, reflecting in his tear-filled eyes. Simon leaned forward, elbows on the desk, studying the young man as if trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. For a long moment, he didn't speak, the silence almost unbearable. Then, finally, in his familiar British tone, he said softly, "I've judged this show for many, many years, and I can honestly say I have never heard anything like that." The crowd erupted again, but Simon motioned for calm, wanting his words to be heard. "What you just did," he continued, his voice filled with sincerity, "wasn't an impression. It wasn't copying. You became Elvis Presley on that stage, not just in voice, but in soul. You brought him back to life for all of us." The audience cheered louder, some standing once more in agreement. Marco's tears began to fall freely. He tried to speak, but emotion caught his throat. "Thank you, sir," he managed, his voice trembling. "Elvis changed my life. I just wanted to honor him, and show that dreams can come true no matter where you come from." His accent was thick, his tone humble, and that only made the moment more touching. Simon nodded, clearly moved. Then, with a small smile forming on his lips, he looked toward the golden buzzer. The crowd noticed immediately and began to scream. Simon glanced at the other judges, who nodded excitedly, and then he pressed it. The familiar explosion of golden confetti burst from above, filling the stage in a dazzling rain of light. Marco gasped, dropping to his knees as the sparkling flakes swirled around him. Tears streamed down his face while he looked up, hands covering his mouth in shock. The audience's cheers grew deafening as Simon stood, clapping proudly. Sofia and Heidi rushed up to hug him, while Howie applauded with both hands in the air. The confetti danced around Marco as he whispered, "Thank you, God, thank you, Elvis." Cameras zoomed in on his face, the face of a dreamer who had just made history. In that golden storm, it was clear, a star had been born, and Simon Cowell himself would never forget the night he heard Elvis's spirit in a Filipino voice.